Well, good evening and welcome to Eastern Mennonite School. I'm so glad that you've taken time this evening to join us. My name is Paul Lehman and I'm head of school here. And this has become an annual tradition that took a 2-year hiatus. And so we are just really thrilled to be back in person. Masks have become optional. This is our first day for masks being optional here at EMS, and so that's your choice. We honor and respect whatever situation you want to have for yourselves. So welcome. This is the 2022 Kennel-Charles Anabaptist Lecture Series with invited guest, pastor, and author Osheta Moore that you will soon hear from. But I want to give some thanks to a variety of people. First, thanks to the Kennel-Charles Endowment, which was started in honor of Elmer and Mary Ann Kennel's parents, to bring history and Anabaptist theology to life at Eastern Mennonite School. And their ideal would be that a person comes and spends a day, 2 days, 3 days with our students and shares with them a little bit about who they are and bring in the history and theology of the Mennonite Church, the Anabaptist Church, to our students. So thank you, Elmer and Mary Ann, for that special endowment. We also have asked for some additional support for this year, and that has come through Menno Media, who has published Osheta's book, and you have opportunity to purchase those and for signings afterwards, and Joe Hackman, who's the director there. So thank you, Joe, for making this possible, as well as the Virginia Mennonite Conference Racial Justice Task Force that Caleb Schrockhurst is leading up. So we are pleased to be part of these groups and the church that is actively working towards improving our church and local communities through anti-racism work. Osheta's book, Dear White Peacemakers, Dismantling Racism Through Grit and Grace, captured our attention here at Eastern Mennonite School in our own anti-racism work and desire to better live within our vision that says where Eastern Mennonite School reflects Christ's light as a learning community where every student belongs, thrives, and lives God's call. We've asked Caleb Schrockhurst to lead us in an opening song, our opening prayer really for the evening, and then I will introduce Osheta.
Hello, everyone. So good to be with you all. Please take out your hymnal. We're going to be singing the African American Spiritual Guide My Feet, number 546. That is 546. And please stand if you're willing.
Wow, you sound great. Benefit of being in the front row. So who is Osheta Moore? I finished, well, we had a strategic leadership team meeting early this year, and one of our topics on the agenda was, who do we want to have as our commencement speaker? And Osheta's name came forward, and I was given an assignment to do a little bit of research on who Osheta Moore was. And it was interesting, shortly after that meeting ended that same afternoon, I was walking down the hallway and I ran into Mr. Ben Bixler, who works at identifying who should be our Kennel-Charles lecturer. And we just had a quick passing. He was in a hurry taking his kids home or to practice somewhere. He was doing fatherly duty, and he said, I'm thinking of Osheta Moore, and that was exactly who we had just finished talking about. So as Osheta shared with our students today, take those as God moments of God's Spirit working. Give God credit for these good things that happen. Don't just count them as circumstance. And so I think we're in for a treat, a person who is in tune with God's Spirit, and I'm glad you're here to witness that tonight. Well, I did my homework. I checked the website out. And I found that she's on pastoral staff at Woodland Hills Church, and that the senior pastor there is another author favorite of mine, Greg Boyd, and so that was kind of, hey, good. Someone pointed me to Jen Hatmaker's podcast, and that's when I first learned of her approach to anti-racism, which I found to be kind of upside down from a lot of things that I read. And it really begins with each person being a beloved person made in the image of God. And that's where we have to start. God's purpose for each of us is unique as individuals, and we have to begin with ourselves as beloved individuals. And I found that to be a refreshing, introspective approach of how to view people and one another. And as her book talks about dismantling racism with grit and grace, that's kind of the grace understanding. And yet, as I've read her book, kind of my third way of introducing myself to Osheta, she also gets into the grit and the hard work and the personal responsibility for people like myself who have privilege. And then over dinner and just on a Zoom call and getting to know Osheta personally, I just find her to be immensely warm, friendly, personable, the kind of person you want to go sit down to and just chat. When I asked her, what would make your week special at the end of the week when you go home to Minneapolis, what would it be? And she said, well, if I was found to be pastoral with students and just getting to relate to them. And I said, yes, that's who we want, both for commencement and our Kennel-Charles. So give a warm welcome to Osheta Moore. We're so glad you are with us. And maybe just make note of questions you have for her. At the end of her presentation, there will be time for questions and response. So make note of those, and we'll have a floating mic afterwards. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so I am going to set up my laptop, which has my notes, but it also has a counter on it, because I am from the Black church tradition, and I can lose track of how long I'm up here talking. And I want to leave room for Q and R. And the idea of Q and R really became a huge part of my learning in a faith environment when my family and I took some time away from the church where my husband was an associate pastor in LA. So he went to seminary in Boston, and then he took an associate pastor role in a church in LA. So we moved our family from Boston to LA and found that it was not a good fit in a lot of ways. And so my husband resigned, and we were effectively without a church community. And this sweet Mennonite congregation, Pasadena Mennonite, welcomed us in, took care of us, loved us really well, and it really allowed us to heal from some of the trauma that we had experienced in that other church. But they had this tradition that I deeply loved where the pastor would get up, or the speaker for the day, usually it was the pastor or his wife, they co-pastor together, and they would say, here's what I've presented for our community today. I've sought the Lord, I've done my homework, and I've put it together. But then afterwards, we're going to have some time for talk back, where the Spirit can speak back to me how he's moving in your life as you heard what I spoke. And I loved that. I love the humility of that. I love the multi-voice aspect of that. And so my husband and I have integrated that into how we do worship. We allow space for talk back. And I call it Q&R, not Q&A, because I don't have all the answers, but I do promise to have a response that hopefully is kind and thoughtful, and that will allow us to continue the conversation. So I want to make sure that I leave some time for that, so I have my little timer going on here. I'm going to start our time together reading just a little bit from the very beginning of my book, and thank you to Caleb, and whose copy is this? Okay, Caleb's copy. Thank you, Caleb, for loaning me your copy. Like, what kind of author am I? I don't even have my own book. So, this chapter is called Come to the Table. I'm going to read a little bit of the opening letter. Dear White Peacemakers, I have begun this introduction letter 3 times and deleted it 3 times. I keep seeing your faces. Mostly, I keep seeing your eyes and the emotions you bring to this conversation on race at this moment of racial uprising. I see the fear, I see the confusion, I see the shame, I see the defensiveness, I see the fog of disinterest and the storm of discomfort. I see you. I also worry about you. You watched George Floyd murdered before your eyes by a white police officer. You watched a viral video of Ahmaud Arbery hunted down and shot by a white father and his son. You held your phones in your hands, doom-scrolling Twitter on January 6, 2021, as white supremacists stormed the U.S. Capitol, holding Confederate flags and erecting a noose. And these are just the racialized events I can think of within the past 6 months. For over 400 years of the violence of white supremacy interwoven into American DNA, I am sure your eyes may have been filled with terror in response to learning about hundreds of instances of racism, the lynchings, the rapes, the expulsion of Black residents to create all-white communities, the silence of the white evangelical church, and so many more acts of harm towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC. America is sick with the sin of white supremacy, and when I sit across from you, white peacemaker, and look into your eyes, I clearly see how overwhelmed you are. What you do in the dawn of racial awareness, when the scales fall from your eyes and you're beginning to see clearly, matters. I'm here to be your honest Black friend, your cheerleader, your companion, your sounding board. As I process how I've come to terms with my calling to practice peace as a Black woman, I hope the Holy Spirit meets you and inspires you as a white person to be a peacemaker for anti-racism. I hope you know that here you are loved and wanted. So I wrote that after spending some time at a protest in George Floyd Square. So George Floyd was murdered before our very eyes, like I just mentioned. And because my husband and I live in St. Paul, which is just 5 minutes away from Minneapolis, 11 minutes from the Cup Foods where George Floyd breathed his last breath, gasped for his last breath. My husband and I, as pastors in the community, my husband is a white man, he's passionate about anti-racism, we felt called to be ministers of peace at the protests. So we chose to go and sort of serve in like this chaplaincy kind of space where we would walk along with the crowd and we would pray alongside as the crowd was chanting. We wanted to pay attention to any sort of things that might get out of hand, any kind of violence or arguments that would happen, and pray and be a presence of peace. And while we were there, we were walking, and I was just noticing that the crowds were filled with so many white people who were chanting and who were passionate about their heartbreak over what they saw happen to George Floyd. And they wanted to hold the authorities accountable. I was walking and I noticed these two white women, probably in their 70s, had a table that was kind of like right in the middle of one of the streets, and it was filled with bottles of water, like stacks and stacks of bottles of water. One was on one side and another was on another side, and they were handing water out as people were protesting and passing them by. And I noticed a young family, a white young family with two small children, and I noticed the mom saying, "Say his name, he mattered." And I thought, wow, she is teaching her children to love every single image bearer. And I remember walking and seeing so many people, so many white peacemakers, as I call them, engaged in this conversation about race, putting their bodies in the line, using their voices. And I thought, who is going to be available to them when they go home? When there isn't another news story, when they are sitting alone by themselves, processing all that they experienced, all that they are learning, who's going to be there for them? What practices do they have, spiritual practices, self-care practices, do they have to be able to stay in this work sustainably, to do this work for the long haul? Who's there to cheer them on and say, good job, thank you for being in this work of dismantling racism? Now, what you don't know about the book writing process is that the editing process is a lot of back and forth, and it's really, really hard. And I was in the middle of writing this book, and I was working on maybe like the second go at it. So I got halfway through the book, and I was like, nope, this isn't right. Because I've published with Harold before, and I said, hey, I think I want to do a book on race and justice from a peacemaking third way perspective. And so the first time I wrote the book, it was very much like, here's all the things you need to know. Like a very kind of professor, like here's the history, here's the sociology of it. And I got about, like I said, halfway through that book, and I was like, this isn't the right book. And at that point, when I was there, I was halfway kind of through another way of writing the book where I was like, here's all the things wrong in the world. Like, you need to step up and fix this. And I was like, that doesn't feel right to me at all. So I came home and I wrote that introduction. I wrote that letter to white peacemakers, and I realized that that's the distinctive Anabaptist voice that I wanted to bring to the conversation, that I kind of had to write my way through. And I realized that for me to bring this voice to this conversation, I needed to kind of go back and look at why did I have those two different kind of approaches to this work? And why did it take me having to be in a space surrounded by white peacemakers doing this work where the Spirit said, this is what I want you to share now? As I was kind of going back and thinking through why it was so hard for me to kind of get to that place where the third time it just really settled. I was like, yes, that's the right voice. And why those two voices came out, I thought of this group that I spent some time with. So about 3 years ago, I spent 9 months with this discipleship group out of Woodland Hills. Woodland has a discipleship program. It's a 9-month program called SOMA. And it's rooted in a historically Black neighborhood in Minneapolis. And so their leader, Kevin, said that an important part of their formation as disciples of Jesus would be to learn to love their neighbor, and their neighbor were African American. And so part of their discipleship was to understand anti-racism. And I realized that when I came into teaching this group, I kind of took on both of those voices, where I would come in and I would say, here's what's wrong in the world, and we've got to fix it, a very prophetic voice. And then I also came in spaces and was like, here's all the things you need to know, and let's figure this out. But what I realized was that I hadn't nurtured that kind of third voice, that very pastoral, inviting somebody in and saying, okay, how is this whole conversation making you feel? And I realized that as I was thinking back, that I had a moment where God convicted me of not living into that more interpersonal way of thinking about talking about race and inviting my white brothers and sisters into this work. So this group that I taught for 9 months on race and justice and race and peacemaking, we decided to do a trip together to explore race in America. And so we went down south and we went to important places on the civil rights journey. So we went to Bryan Stevenson's Equal Justice Museum. We went to the Lynching Memorial. We spent some time learning about Martin Luther King and went to the motel where he was shot and the museum that was connected to it. We went to the place where Michael Brown died in Ferguson. And I realized that as I was on that trip, because I hadn't spent any time caring about the emotions of the people on that trip, I was focused on, are they learning enough? Or are they planning to do the right thing next? And I realized that not paying attention to that made me really susceptible to taking on some of the anger and the bitterness and the violence that I was seeing in all these different places. Seeing people that look like my fellow sojourners who look exactly like them, white people doing horrible things to people who looked like me. And there was a moment on that trip where I was sitting beside a lake and I was praying and I was saying, God, I don't know what to do with all of this anger inside of me. Like, I feel like the violence that I'm looking at, I'm taking in, and I want to figure out a way to just make this group feel really bad. Like, I recognize that in that moment, I could have easily just the next day in our conversation just kind of laid down the law of like, this is all wrong and you've got to fix it. Or let me show you more information, give you more things to do. And I knew I could do that, and I knew that they would take it because they wanted to prove themselves as worthy anti-racists. But I was sitting by that lake and I was praying and I asked the Lord to help me be a peacemaker, to help me first access peace within so I can make peace in this group. But I had no idea how that was going to look. A couple days later, we were on our way home and we were stopping in a convenience store and we were all done. We were done with the trip, we were done with each other. And so we were at a convenience store and we were all going in to just kind of like gas up, get our snacks. And I didn't want to talk to anybody. I really didn't want to look at anybody. I just wanted to go in and get a Frappuccino and those white powdered sugar donuts that I only let myself get on road trips. And I went in and I gathered those things and I was walking out and I was on my way to the van and out of the corner of my eye I saw one of these women leaning up against the convenience store wall, just sobbing. Her face was red, her shoulders were heaving, and she just was done. I could tell she was exhausted and she was done. And there was a part of me that leaned into that kind of retributive violence that I had watched and that I had taken in over those many days on that trip. And I thought, good. She looks the way I have felt as a Black woman living in this world that is so complicit to racism every day. She's feeling in this moment how I feel on the inside. Good. And at that moment, the Spirit said, nope, she's not feeling conviction. She is no longer convinced that she is beloved. She has spent this whole week watching videos and learning things and looking at pictures of people who look like her and look like her family and look like her trusted mentors, doing horrible things to people who look like you. She no longer feels beloved. And in that moment, I was the convicted one. So I went over to her and I hugged her and I said, you're going to be okay. And that was the first time that I started to speak belovedness over a peacemaker. And that changed everything. So when I was sitting and writing that first part of the letter, I was tapping into that thing that I had experienced on that trip and realized that this is my particular contribution to the current conversation we are having around race. Now, I'm sure when you saw the title of my book, Dear White Peacemakers, and you knew that we were going to be talking about racism tonight, maybe there's a little bit of apprehension, maybe there's a little bit of, here's my experience around that. And so you're bringing that into this space. And I want to kind of do a quick overview, just look at some of the ways that we have been taught to engage in this work and then offer a new perspective. You see, one of the things that I was pushing up against so hard when I was with that group was them taking on this view that to dismantle racism meant that we were doing racial reconciliation. Meaning, as long as I am reconciled to the people of color in my community, as long as I don't have any bad feelings about people of color, as long as I don't see anything like that happening in my community, like we're a generally nice, polite group of people, then race is not a problem. And I realized that has been a narrative, and that has been an invitation into this conversation that many of us have picked up. I know for myself that when I was in church as a teenager, and my church in southern Texas was starting to talk about division, and we really didn't say racism that much because we really leaned into a colorblind view of that there's no Jew nor Greek. When we were talking about these sort of issues, kind of dancing around it, we coded it as racial reconciliation. And racial reconciliation, again, is really leaning into that interpersonal piece. But here is the problem with only thinking of doing this work from that interpersonal, hey, we're okay, we're great, I don't see it, and the people of color in my life know that they matter to me. When we only think about that, we don't allow ourselves to look at the systemic issues in the world. You see, I was a part of a church, a mostly white church. My mentors are a white couple who the husband of that couple gave me away at my wedding because my own father wouldn't. These people loved me dearly. They would pick me up and bring me to church every Sunday because my parents couldn't make it happen or wouldn't for a variety of reasons. They let me sleep at their homes over the weekend to make sure that I could get to church on Sunday. They took me door to door to share my testimony. These people loved me and loved Jesus, and they were white. But when I was in that church at 17 years old, I saw something horrible on the news happened to a black man. He was picked up by three of his friends, three white friends. Well, one of them was somebody that he considered a friend. The other two he didn't know. And they offered to take him home. It was very early in the morning. He was already walking home. They offered to take him a little bit further down the road, but they didn't. They took him to a place, and they beat him, and they defecated on him, and they urinated on him, and then they tied him to the back of their pickup truck, and they drove him for a few miles as he was slowly dismembered. And then they just threw his body into the cemetery that was reserved for the black members of the community. And I watched the news story of this, and I sat next to my black father, who is as stoic could be, watching him watch the news with tears streaming down his face. I was so traumatized from that news story that I wouldn't walk to school for the rest of that week. I had my mother leave work early to pick me up and take me home. And when I walked into church on Sunday morning, all I wanted was to know if God saw how sad and scared I was that past week. All I wanted was for somebody to just hug me and say, hey, I saw what happened. That's horrible. What do you need? And we didn't. When we only think of our contribution, our work to dismantling racism as long as our interpersonal relationships work, what happens is those people of color in your life, they'll safe with you, but then we go out in the world that is still complicit to racism, and we experience atrocities, and that should not be in the church. When a person of color comes into the church, they need to know that Jesus sees them and loves them and knows the hardship that they experience. So we have to talk about race on a systemic level. Racial reconciliation invites us into a posture of grace, though. It is good. We don't want to get rid of the idea of an interpersonal relationship towards one another because disciples of Jesus should maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. But that is not enough. So I was afraid of that group wholly thinking of race as long as our conversation and our relationship is great. I wanted them to care about the justice piece, but doing that, only thinking about the systemic piece, cauterized that empathy, that interpersonal, how are you doing in this conversation part. See, when I only care about whether or not you're protesting or reading the right things, I don't care if as you're protesting, you're feeling overwhelmed and your heart's beating fast when you get back home and your mind is racing because you're processing all that you took in. When I only care about what you're reading, I don't care that if you're sitting at your couch and you're reading this description of something horrible happens, you're brought to tears and you feel this pit in your stomach. All I care about is whether or not you're doing the work. And so that's kind of where I swung to the other side in my teaching of race, was, okay, let's just focus on the systemic stuff. And that's a way that I think a lot of us have been, in this moment, have been introduced to race. Since George Floyd, there have been a lot of resources and a lot of leaders who step up and say, what are you doing? What are you reading? Your silence is violence. But when we only think about race as a systemic piece, we lose that empathy. So anti-racism is good in some senses. So it calls us into that grit part, that what are you doing, what are you reading? Because we're committed to take up our cross and follow Jesus. But that's not enough. We have to have that empathy piece. We need a third way. We need a way that combines the grace of peacemaking, or the grace of racial reconciliation, the community, the care, the love, the empathy that is so prevalent in that racial reconciliation piece. Because I knew that those white mentors loved me and cared for me, but I didn't know those white mentors would do what needed to be done to hold those men accountable for what they did to that man. And I also know that there are some white peacemakers who are so learned and so ready, and they're always there to do the work, but I don't know if they're taking care of themselves, and I don't know if they have the practices that will keep them in this work for the long haul. And also, because of the way that as a person of color, I've been encouraged to enter into this work, I can say, yeah, you do the work. I don't care about your emotions. Thinking about your emotions centers you and not me, and it breaks relationship. So we need a new way, or at least I needed a new way. And when I wrote that introduction, that third time, the Spirit said, this is the way that I want you to do this work. And it's a way that I kind of have been living in a variety of different ways. I've been living anti-racism. I've been living peacemaking since I wrote my first book on Shalom. But I hadn't really thought about those two pieces interconnected. So we needed a way towards anti-racism that actively opposes thoughts, beliefs, and actions that reinforce white supremacy. We also need a way of peacemaking. We are peacemakers. Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Jesus modeled a peace ethic for us. We are people who actively oppose thoughts, beliefs, and actions that reinforce oppression, shame, violence in word, thought, and deed, and a lack of empathy. So this book is an exploration of anti-racism peacemaking, or becoming an anti-racism peacemaker. A person who actively works towards a holistic restoration of the interpersonal and the systemic effects of white supremacy through nonviolence and empathy. As I thought back on that trip, the best parts of that trip was when we spent time learning from Dr. Martin Luther King and learning his work. I love that a huge aspect of his work was centered on peace and nonviolence. As an Anabaptist, that's my jam. But I also love this distinction about the work that he had. He was working towards something called the beloved community. When Dr. King was at Boston College, there was a philosophical idea that was quite popular from Josiah Royce. He was a philosopher who introduced this idea of the beloved community, a group of people who are committed to the flourishing of one another. And so when Dr. King taught, he taught this idea of the beloved community. And I thought, wow, we already have so much good work going on in the church right now around belovedness. What if we enter into this conversation about race as not what is your interpersonal relationships like, which is important, and not just what are you reading, who are you learning from, what are you doing, which is important, but how are you? How are you doing as you enter into this work? What are you bringing into this work as a human being? And as a Christian, I'm asking, how do you come into this work knowing you are beloved? And so I started to integrate belovedness into my teaching because Dr. King says that the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. That is the long-term, sustainable goal that we as kingdom people should be seeking. Not are we training a bunch of people who know how to find the right resources and show up when something bad happens, and not are we polite and kind and good and just, aware that people of color are like different than us, but not really exploring why there's a difference there, or maybe their experience is different than ours, kind of just turning a blind eye to it. But living in such a way that we are a community, where we are friends, that we have understanding and goodwill towards each other. This is the kind of world that I want to live in, a world where I own my belovedness, and you own your belovedness, and I proclaim your belovedness, and you proclaim my belovedness, and we become the beloved community. So I started teaching my classes to seek becoming the beloved community first and foremost. And I would introduce this thought from Nouwen to them. I would say, we want to become the beloved community because Nouwen says, if it is true that we are not only beloved, but also have to become the beloved, if it is true that we not only are children of God, but also have to become the children of God, if all of this is true, how then can we get a grip on this process of becoming? If the spiritual life is not simply a way of being, but a way of becoming, when then is this nature of becoming? The nature of this becoming as anti-racism peacemakers is now, by owning our belovedness, proclaiming each other's belovedness, and becoming the beloved community. So when I begin my classes now, after introducing them to these ideas from Nouwen and Dr. King around belovedness, I mean, they're always kind of thrown for a loop because they come in thinking that I'm going to start with, I'll start with when the first enslaved people came over, or they think I'm going to kind of give them the history of civil rights. And I'm like, nope, we're going to just sit for a while in belovedness. We're going to claim that we are beloved, and we're going to remind ourselves that we are made in the image of God, and every single person is made in the image of God. And we're going to sit in this reality that God's desire is for all of us to be beloved, and then we're going to step back and we're going to look at racism from that perspective. Does racism prevent all of us from feeling fully human and being fully beloved? And if it does, then we must dismantle it, but dismantle it together. So in my classes, we begin with this mantra on becoming the beloved community. So I say to them, my friends, I am beloved. And then they'll say, I am beloved. And then I'll say, you are beloved. And they'll say back to me, you are beloved. And I just always get a little thrill and tickle because it feels good to be told I'm beloved. And then I invite us to stand or hold hands or circle up, or if we were in Zoom, to turn our mics on. And then we would say, we are beloved. And we would do that at the beginning of our classes in order to remind us that the end is becoming the beloved community. And in doing that, we can live into the grit and grace of this calling to be anti-racism peacemakers. So in closing, before I open this up for Q&R, and I know those are traveling mic that'll be going around, I would like to invite you to do this practice with me. So I'm going to say I'm beloved. I'm going to invite you to take a moment, take a deep breath, and then own your belovedness by saying I am beloved. And then I'm going to say to you all, you are beloved. And then I'm going to invite you to say it back to me. And then I'm going to encourage us to kind of look around the room and make eye contact with someone. And we're going to say, we are beloved. So join me in this closing practice. So my fellow peacemakers, I am beloved. You are beloved. Thank you. Now make eye contact with someone in the room. And on the count of 3, let's say it together. 1, 2, 3. We are beloved. Amen. Thank you.
Here, if just raise your hand, I'll bring it to you.
And when you ask a question, will you say your name so I can address you by your name?
It's really wonderful to have you here, Osheta. Osheta?
Yes, Osheta. Hi, what's your
Osheta?
name?
My name is Greta Kreider,
Hi, Greta.
and my question for you is, do you speak with many communities that are not faith communities, and does that feel like it would work for you? I heard a little bit more tonight in reading your book. It's very faith-based, and I appreciate that. And I'm just curious how much you want personally, if that is something that your work calls you to, or how you feel like the message might translate to people of other faiths or who are not, rooted in a faith community.
That's a really good question. I am unapologetically Jesus-y. So if somebody is not a person of faith, but they want to learn from me, they're going to get some Jesus in there. And as long as they're okay with that, then I'll offer that. Because I do believe that one of the things that I have noticed in people who are in my age group who have left the church for a variety of reasons, or who feel allergic or feel traumatized by having a faith conversation or rooting something in faith, they still can agree that there's human dignity and there's human worth. And so when I have a conversation with them, I say, yes, we all are made in God's image. We all have human dignity. And so, I might change some of the beloved language to maybe human dignity language if that's necessary. But I try very hard to not veer away from the fact that I'm a disciple of Jesus, and Jesus is going to show up in the way that I talk about the work that I do. I hope that answered your question.
Hello.
Hi.
Goodness, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
My name is Abby. And so, I really loved what you were saying as a pacifist. This is something that really resonated well with me. But something that I'm still struggling to sit with as I work through my own anti-racism work is, how do you meet people with such grit and grace, as you're saying, when they are so far on the margin? So I think back to this past summer, here in Harrisonburg, there were a lot of heated conversations, particularly at the school board and around school board identity. And one of the local pastors literally put a call out for people to bring their guns to the school board meeting to show the school board who's boss. And I really struggle meeting people in spaces like that, telling them that they are beloved too, trying to meet them when it's so extreme.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Abby. So one of the kind of boundaries or things about my self-awareness that I know is that in order for me to make peace, I have to do that work of peace on the inside. And so if somebody is really rubbing me the wrong way, I have a whole kind of protocol, if you will, or like a process that I do with the Spirit for a few days where I remind myself of their belovedness before I even speak of them. I won't read anything written by them. I won't engage with them. It is this work of enemy love, honestly, first, before I can get out there and do peacemaking, where I will look at pictures of them when they were children. I will look at pictures of them with their family. I will tell myself I'm beloved and that when Jesus died, he died not just for me, he died for them too. And when I get to that place where I can do as Jesus says, pray for them, then I will engage with them if I have the opportunity to. So if I know that there's going to be a school board meeting or something, and I know that there's a leader who's particularly on the opposite side, who maybe is against critical race theory in the schools, to say, and I know there's a school board meeting, and I feel that God is calling me to be at that meeting, I will do that work before I go to that meeting. And then I'll be at that meeting and I'll be a presence of peace. I'll pray and I'll be really thoughtful about the way I talk about the issue that doesn't cast blame or shame. So this is one of the reasons why I don't call white people racist, because I don't want to separate you from anything other than your belovedness. And so that's kind of the work that I do as a pacifist in order to step into this work. And I have to say, sometimes I don't show up in spaces because I haven't done that work, because I'm still really, really angry. But I'd much rather pray and trust that the Spirit will take somebody else who has done that work and put them in that place, because I don't have to be the only one. Ashley?
Yes, ma'am.
Can I hug you? Okay. Are you? Oh.
Sorry.
Don't be sorry.
I know. My trans son was attacked verbally at those school board meetings. And I couldn't sleep for weeks after. Devastated that people hated him to his face. How do you move past that?
How do you get past that? Can I hug you first before I answer this question? Is that okay? Okay, just meet me right here. Give me a second, guys. So I get that. Because my son was called the N-word by a coach in his school, and the school spent the whole day basically trying to cover it up. They gaslit my son. They put him in a ton of meetings where they tried to tell him, you didn't hear what you heard. There's no way that coach could have said that because he took a black girl to prom. My son was deeply, deeply harmed by that school. And for me, how I had to get past that was not on my own. I was fiercely protective of my son and held those authority figures accountable. I had to spend weeks proclaiming my son's belovedness, and my son's biracial, so I had to also do that work of, you're part white too, so like you can't hate that part of yourself. But what was really important for me were a few things. One, I had a community around me that cared for my family's felt needs. So I don't think I cooked for that whole 2 weeks after it happened because people were providing for us. There are people who are more gifted with that prophetic voice that like went to the school and like held the school accountable and was like, just so you know, there are people watching how you handle this. I have a spiritual director, so I had to spend a lot of time with my spiritual director. I mean, honestly, for me, I was like, did I do this to my son? Like, I'm Black. Did I put him in this position that he is moving through this world, you know, suffering, being called the N-word? Like, if he were any other race, if he were white, he probably wouldn't have experienced that. So I had to deal with a lot of work with my therapist and my spiritual director. And I think also, too, I had to trust that that healing is going to take some time, and to just take it one day at a time. And so every day that my kids came home and I would proclaim their belovedness over them, and they'd be like, I know, Mom. I'm like, I count that as a win. We're bandaging up some of the harm. Because when my son was called the N-word in his middle school, and his siblings were still at elementary school, they did not want to go back to that school. So when something like that happens, so your trans child experienced that, like, I know it just doesn't affect, what's their pronouns? Okay, he, him. I know it doesn't just affect him. I know it affects everyone. So just be patient and gentle with yourself. Surround yourself with people who reaffirm God's goodness and the image of God in you, and really just hold on to your belovedness. And I have 1,000 more thoughts, but I hope that helps you get going. All right. Oh, Mike over here.
Time for a few questions yet. We're going to try to finish up by 8 o'clock, and Osheta will be around out in the foyer for book signing and personal direct questions as well. So.
My name's Mike Stemple. My question is, I think of the Reverend Robert Turner from, Tulsa, that he had led a church in Tulsa. But the phrase he used there, what do you think about the phrase, we can't have reconciliation without reparations?
You remember that thing I said about how I don't have all the answers, but I have responses? I do believe that that is the case, because if we are in conflict with somebody has harmed us. I write a little bit in the book about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, and that reconciliation has active measures and reparations, repair. So my husband and I have this thing that we do when we have an argument. We call them reconciliation gummy bears. Whenever we have an argument, and we've sat down and we've processed it and we talk about it, one of us will bring the other person's favorite sweet treat. There was a season in our life where it was gummy bears, and I was the one who was being, who was being harmed a little bit more than him, and so he was asking for a lot of forgiveness in that season, and so he was bringing a lot of gummy bears, and we made a joke that reconciliation gummy bears is how it sticks. But there's an act of like, hey, we have talked this through, but like now we need something that seals, like that's an offering, a peace offering, if you will, right? Because that shows that you're putting your resources and your time and your thought to repairing the relationship. When I think about racism and I think about like the division that is caused because of white supremacy, I don't think about it just as a historical or societal problem. It is an interpersonal problem. It is a problem that affects real people and how real people live their real lives. And so repair has to be a part of that. Now, to what degree or what that looks like, there are college courses and dissertations and so many other smarter people who can figure that out. But we as people who follow Jesus, who actually put his life and body on the line for repair, need to be willing to have some sort of conversation about repair. Now that can look 1,000 different ways. Like I have a friend who, I started calling it her everyday reparations, because what she does is every time she does something great for herself, like a pedicure or a massage, or she buys something great, she takes that exact dollar amount and turns it towards a felt need for a person of color in her life. That is a form of repair, because she's acknowledging that that person of color is moving through the world, tapping into historical trauma on a regular basis, and these felt things help her feel fully human. So I leave it up to the Spirit, and I leave it up to your leadership to have conversations about what repair looks like. But I do think that it's an important part. I mean, if we want to get historical, I mean, when newly enslaved people were finally set free, they were protected and they were able to start flourishing. And then there were acts of Congress that took away that protection and that capacity to flourish. And that's when we saw Jim Crow laws really step in and more violence enter in. So there was a season of repair, and that was stripped away, and then that ushered in violence. As peacemakers, we need to pay attention to that.
One final question.
Hi, my name is Claire DeBrun, and I really appreciate what you're saying about the spiritual journey and working on our own ways of reparation and all of those things. But I'm also reminded something my pastor shared Sunday, that when we pray, from Karl Barth, saying when we pray, we should have a Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And I feel, I'm totally with you on individualizing those changes, but I'm also a firm believer that for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing.
Yeah.
And I think if we don't create a sense of urgency about major issues that are racial, war, peace and justice, social issues, and we don't inform ourselves, it makes it hard to create a sense of urgency. And I strongly believe without urgency, we're not motivated to change or to speak out. So I like to dovetail, and I think we need agency in our lives to be able to do that as we work corporately together, which is why I'm really grateful for the Mennonite Church and the Anabaptist. Thank you.
What's your name again? I didn't hear.
Sorry, Claire.
Claire?
Yes.
So Claire, 100% yes. So this is why for me, when I teach about anti-racism, I say it's important for you to know. It's important for you. I'm not worried that you're going to have calls to action. I'm not worried that you're going to have opportunities to step in. What I am concerned about is a bunch of people who step into that work and get their sense of identity and worth from that work. I'm concerned about white peacemakers who step into that work and are prepared to be shamed or blamed or emotionally harmed as a way of saying, yes, I'm doing this work. I think that we can create urgency and a sense of now without creating emotional harm and spiritual harm. And so when part of the reason I'm doing this work is because I want to be able to hold those two things in tension, the grit and grace. And I'm actually becoming a spiritual director. I'm in a program now in order to sit with white peacemakers as they're learning and doing this work to continue holding that peace. Because I firmly believe we have no business being out there making peace if we haven't done some of that internal work. We're just potentially causing more harm. This is where you get kind of the pushback of like white savior and all these kind of things, because there are white peacemakers who haven't done that work, that sustainable internal work. They're getting in that work, feeling super overwhelmed, and bringing vestiges of white supremacy that like, I need to be in charge, I have all the ideas, I read the newspaper so I know what's up, and they're entering into that work, not from a place of humility and self-awareness. So it's a both and, but thank you for dovetailing that, Claire. I appreciate it.
Well, let's share our thanks to Osheta, and again, she will be here in the foyer.